Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
At my brother's graduation party, my mom tugged at my sleeve, leaned in close like we were sharing some harmless secret, and said in that voice she uses when she wants to sound loving while making a rule, "Please do not bring up your news. This is his day." And I nodded because arguing in that moment would only feed the narrative that I make things about me, even though the news she was burying was not a cute side note or a happy coincidence, but the kind of life shift that changes the map of your future. The sort of thing people in our family have quietly decided belongs to whoever talks the loudest about it, and in this house the loudest has never been me. I told myself to breathe, to sit down, to let the compliments and back slaps wash over the person who has been handed headlines since we were kids, and while everyone piled plates and toasted his new degree and the big plans he had hinted about for weeks, I sat with my folded hands and my dry smile and replayed the call I took 2 days ago from the director of the fellowship, the one I earned after a year of brutal interviews and late nights and measurable work, the same fellowship my brother applied to and did not get, the same one he started describing to relatives like it was somehow already his, and I remember how gentle the director sounded when she said, "We heard from a family member claiming to be a liaison for you. Is that accurate?" And how something in me went from hurt to steel, because I realized the story I was told to keep quiet was already being retold without me, and not as a misunderstanding but as a plan. So when Mom said not today, let him have this, I decided to do what she asked, but I also decided to redefine what quiet looks like, because quiet does not have to mean powerless, and silence can be preparation if you use it right. And that morning, before I put on a smile and showed up with a gift that he would not notice and a card he would not read, I sent 3 emails that were short, clean, and impossible to confuse. One to the fellowship director confirming in writing that I, and only I, would handle communication about the placement. One to the HR contact at the partner organization listing my phone as the sole point of contact. And one to my brother, polite and careful, clarifying that he should not represent himself as my liaison or spokesperson in any setting because the legal paperwork uses my name, my credentials, and my signature, and although I kept the tone soft, I copied the director and the HR contact, which meant the record existed whether he replied or not. I also went into the application portal, the one he had asked to peek at a few months back under the excuse of curiosity, and I changed the password to a phrase only I would remember. Then turned on the kind of 2-step verification that dings my phone every time someone even thinks about logging in, and because experience has taught me that people do not stop at the front door when they think the house is theirs, I set up alerts on my personal email for my name plus the word fellowship and for the program's acronym, a move that sounds paranoid until you have lived inside a family where stories migrate like furniture and end up arranged to suit whoever claims the room. So there I was at the party that was not about me, listening to my brother repeat the same humble brag lines about what might be next and how certain opportunities were lining up, watching my mother beam like a fan club president. And every time my chest tightened, I promised myself I would keep my voice out of the spotlight today, not because I agree with her rules, but because there is a different kind of power in letting people talk while you line up facts that do not need your volume to be heard, and I reminded myself that silence is not surrender if you're building a better microphone. I wish I could say I was surprised when his friends started circling the same rumor I had been hearing for weeks, the one about an organization out of state that wanted him for a leadership track, which is almost exactly how my offer letter describes my role. And I watched him nod along like he had been scouted while I was apparently a background extra in my own story, and something about that quieted me further, not because I felt small, but because in that second I knew I was done trying to correct whispers in hallways and group chats, since emails with signatures and letterheads do that for you without raised voices or tears. Here is the part one have not told anyone, not even my closest friend who would have told me to flip the whole table. The night before the party, I drafted a thank you note to the donor who sponsors my fellowship cohort. A simple message I planned to send first thing Monday, but I scheduled it for this afternoon instead, timed so that anyone who checked their phone during dessert might see a perfectly timed reply from the donor's office. One that mentions my full name and the words, "We are thrilled to welcome you. Because you cannot argue with a calendar invite you did not create or a donor who has your resume in front of them. And while that might sound petty, to me it felt like a seatbelt, because if someone decided to drive this story off a cliff, I wanted to be the one who walked away. So yes, I honored my mother's request. I did not grab a microphone, I did not announce anything, and I did not yank the spotlight, but I did button up every possible door that had my name on it. I did put a thin paper trail between me and his lie. And I did decide that if the truth walked in on its own, I would not block the door or apologize for the sound it made. And by the time everyone settled into their chairs and the plates quieted down, I was calmer than I had been in weeks, because whatever happened next would not rely on me performing sweetness while swallowing glass. And then his best friend, the one who always speaks like he is starting a podcast, stood up and tapped a fork against a glass and grinned at the room, and my mother whispered again, "Please, not now," and I looked at her and said nothing, because I did not need to say anything, and the friend raised his voice just enough so the cousins at the back could hear and said, "Before we congratulate him, there is a secret he has been keeping," and in the split second before the room tilted toward him, my phone buzzed with a new email that popped my name to the top of the screen, and I did not open it. I only let it sit there, like a card you keep face down until the dealer asks you to show your hand. The room went quiet in that way where people pretend they are still chewing, but everyone's attention has moved to the one person holding a glass and his best friend, who has always loved being the MC even when nobody asked for an MC. Smiled at my brother and said he wanted to go first because not everyone knows the full picture of what is about to happen next, which, if you have ever lived inside a family where rumors are currency, is the kind of sentence that makes your stomach choose between a laugh and a fight, and I felt my mother's hand press against my arm like a warning label while my brother did that mock humble look he uses whenever he is about to let someone else brag for him. The friend started with the usual syrup about hard work and dedication, and how my brother never gives up, and then he slipped into the part that made the air change. Because he said there was a leadership fellowship with a national partner that had been circling my brother for months, and that my brother had been too classy to announce it while he was still weighing family obligations. And the table made that approving sound people make when they think they are watching a selfless act, while I sat so still it felt like my chair had become part of me. Because the phrase he used was not generic, it was the exact phrasing from my acceptance letter, right down to the way the partner organization describes the role. And I knew in that instant this was not a sloppy mix-up, but a rehearsed story that had been told in group chats and late-night calls, and probably at a bar where the volume made exaggeration sound heroic. My brother laughed, the easy, fake surprised laugh that buys time, and said his friend was overselling and that nothing was official and that he did not want to jinx anything. And he threw me a quick glance like he was checking whether I would swallow it the way I have swallowed other things so that Mom would not have to do cleanup later. But I did not speak, because silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is consent for someone to keep talking long enough to tie their own knot, and I watched. My mother tried to redirect the toast into a safer lane about fond childhood memories, and before the friend could be steered away, I did the smallest, pettiest, perfectly legal thing I could think of, which was to text him 2 words while he was still holding the glass, 2 words that looked like support but were really a fuse. Be specific. I knew he keeps his phone on vibrate in his pocket because he is one of those people who loves to read the room and play to it, and sure enough he checked the buzz, glanced down, saw my name, and his face lit up like he had just been given permission to go bigger. And he said the name of the fellowship out loud, the full name, the one you cannot mistake or blur into something else, and then he said that my brother had been approached for the cohort and that everyone should know he chose family first, but would make a decision soon, and the tables erupted into that admiring chatter that pretends to be private while traveling the speed of light, and on the surface I was still and polite, but inside I felt the clean click of a door locking. Because once you say a proper noun into a room, you are no longer playing in rumor, you are drafting a public record, and public records are my favorite place to work. My brother tried to soften it by saying opportunities come to lots of people, that it is a process, that nothing is confirmed, and I almost admired the way he tried to roll it back a step without admitting there was a step to roll back from. But the friend, high on his own roll, doubled down with a wink and said that in case anyone was wondering, the leadership track was out of state and the start date was early fall. And that phrase hit the table with a thud for one simple reason: early fall is written in my packet, along with the partner's training calendar, and you do not land on that by coincidence unless someone fed you the lines. I sat through 2 more toasts that were suddenly a little less enthusiastic because people were now busy piecing the story together in their heads, and while my mother kept touching my wrist like she could physically hold me inside her rule, I opened a new text to the one person who did not need the whole backstory to understand what was happening, which was the regional liaison from the partner organization, a woman named Karen who had reached out after the offer to say she lived not far from us and would be my local point of contact before I moved. And my message was not dramatic, it was practical and sweet and absolutely lethal, because I wrote that we were at my brother's graduation lunch, that his best friend had just announced to the room that my brother was joining the fellowship I accepted, that there seemed to be confusion, and that if she had a minute today to swing by for a quick hello, it might help me thank her in person and gently clear up the mix without making a scene. And in the same breath, I attached a screenshot of my signed acceptance and the most recent email thread where she used my full name and role title, not because I wanted her to march in with paperwork, but because I wanted her to see what I meant when I said this was not a misunderstanding, it was a performance. While I waited for her reply, I did one more thing that will sound petty until you see how clean it is, which was to send a second text, this time to my brother, with a single sentence that he could not read out loud without detonating his own story. Hey, since your friend already said the fellowship name, please stop presenting my offer as yours. It's making this awkward, and because I am not interested in a debate by phone in a room full of relatives, I turned my screen face down and sipped water and let him decide whether to look at it now and choke on the moment, or look at it later and choke on the aftermath. Across the table, the best friend lifted his glass again to finish the toast and went into a bit about character, how my brother puts family first, how he sacrifices, how he is the kind of man who turns down shiny things to be there for people. And there was a brief murmur of approval, but it had thinned out because once you name something, people start Googling it under the table, and while I did not want to trigger a phone frenzy, I was not going to protect a lie from the friction of reality. And just as I was wondering whether the friend would keep digging, my phone buzzed in that distinct way that means it is an email, not a text, and then it buzzed again with a new message from Karen, short and perfect. I can be there in 20 minutes. Where should I go? Which I answered with the simplest directions and a thank you that looked polite, but felt like a chess piece sliding into a winning square, and then I set the phone down and smiled at my mother the way a person smiles when they have followed the rules exactly as written and have decided to let the rules do the talking for them, while my brother looked at his screen, went very still, and the best friend, still standing, read a notification that made the grin slip just enough for me to see that he had received the screenshot I sent him of my offer letter with my name in bold at the top, which he tried to pocket like a hot coin, and he cleared his throat and said, "Anyway," to the man of the hour, and I lifted my glass with everyone else and said nothing, because the next sound worth hearing was a knock at the door. The 20 minutes between his friend's toast and whatever would happen next stretched in that weird way time does when you are waiting for a shoe to drop that you have already measured and photographed and labeled. And while plates were being cleared and a cousin started a story nobody cared about, I sat very still and did the thing that has always saved me when people assume my silence means I am helpless, which is to quietly organize the truth into a shape that cannot be pushed over by charm or volume. And I started with a mental inventory of everyone he had looped into his version of my news: the aunt who believes anything said with confidence, the neighbor he tries to impress because the neighbor once worked for a big firm, the old coach who still thinks he is a prodigy, and then I added his best friend, who clearly enjoyed being the delivery service for a headline that did not belong to him, and as I counted them, I could feel the same old anger trying to stand up in my chest. Like an alarm, except this time I did not let it run the show, because anger is noisy and sloppy and helps people paint you as dramatic, while documentation is boring and relentless and makes people stop mid-sentence. Weeks before this party, I had started collecting the crumbs he left behind whenever he told my story like it was his, not because I thought I would ever need to confront him in a room full of relatives, but because I have learned the hard way that if you do not keep receipts in this family, you end up apologizing to the person who took your wallet. So I had screenshots of texts where he used my phrases to pitch himself to someone he wanted to meet. I had a voicemail where he told a cousin that he might be moving for a leadership track with a national partner. I had a photo someone else sent from a group chat where he posted the partner's logo with a wink. And I had the acceptance documents in a folder that I had renamed with my full name spelled out in a way that would make even the most stubborn relative hesitate before calling it a misunderstanding. And it sounds overcautious until you remember that people like my brother do not back down when they are caught, they pivot and talk faster, and the only thing that slows them is the sound of their own words read back to them. What I had not told anyone was that 2 nights earlier, when I could not sleep from the mix of excitement and dread, I went through my contacts and built a small, neat list of everyone who had congratulated him on my news, which I knew about because they had also congratulated me in private with phrases like "proud of your whole family" or "your brother must be thrilled," and I drafted a message that was neither a call-out nor a confession, just a clear thank you that named the program and explained that I had accepted and would be relocating in early fall, and I left the tone so friendly that nobody could accuse me of gloating, while the fact of it would yank the story back where it belonged, and I addressed it BCC so nobody felt exposed. Then I saved it in drafts, because sending it at the wrong time would make me look like I had crashed a party, and sending it at the right time would look like what it was, which is housekeeping. There is something calming about having a plan that does not require a raised voice, and as my mother kept squeezing my wrist like she could lower my temperature with her fingers, I realized that she was less worried about my feelings and more worried about optics. Because in our family her brand is order and my brother's brand is promise, and my role, historically, has been to swallow things whole so dinner can end on time, and it hit me that I did not need her permission to be kind to myself. I needed her to see what it looks like when I refuse to be conscripted into silence, and the funniest part was how simple it suddenly felt, like someone had pointed out the fire escape that was there the whole time. Across the table, an uncle asked my brother if the fellowship meant he would be leaving town, and my brother did the dance he always does where he gives a non-answer that still makes him sound chosen. And I caught the best friend watching me like he could not decide whether to double down or pivot, and I remembered every Thanksgiving where I made room for his stories because they made my mother breathe easier. And I decided that I was done making anyone comfortable at my own expense, so I slid my phone out from under my napkin and opened the draft I had written days ago and changed exactly 3 things: the subject line to include "thank you" and an actual program name. A sentence to add that I was grateful to everyone who had encouraged me over the past year, and a sign-off that made it clear I would be on the move soon but reachable. And then I hovered over send and waited for the tiny tremor of doubt that usually stops me. And when it did not come, I sent it, and the whoosh sounded louder than the buzz of a room pretending it was still about my brother. I did not stop there, because the best revenge is not a single blow, it is a calm sequence that clicks into place so smoothly the other person cannot find a surface to push back against. So I opened LinkedIn, which is the only social platform my extended family actually pays attention to because it feels respectable, and I published the update I had drafted with the donor tag and the partners page, and I did not add a selfie or exclamation marks. I just wrote the clear sentence that the organization had asked me to use in their public announcement, and I watched the first 2 congratulatory comments land from people who work at the partner, and I let the algorithm do what it does when a verified page likes your post, which is to ping everyone within a few degrees of you, and I set the phone face down again, not because I was hiding, but because I prefer to watch people react without the distraction of my own screen lighting up. Within a minute, I watched 3 heads dip to glance at their phones and then lift with that small, surprised smile people get when a piece of information rearranges a story they thought they understood, and it moved across the tables like a hush nobody knew how to fill, while my mother pretended not to notice and my brother kept stabbing at a piece of cake that suddenly required all his focus, and in that moment I felt something unclench that had been tight for years, not because I had humiliated anyone, but because I had told the truth in a voice they could not turn down, and whatever happened next would not be an argument about who said what when. It would be a series of facts they could either acknowledge or avoid, and either way, I would be fine. The best friend raised his glass yet again like he could drown the silence with one more burst of charm, and he was halfway through a joke when he looked down at his phone and stopped, because he had evidently just received the email I sent. The one that included him because 2 weeks ago he had messaged me congratulations on your brother's big opportunity, and I saw his eyebrows flicker as he made the mental calculation between doubling down on a lie and pivoting to an escape route, and before he could choose, there was a small commotion near the entryway, the polite kind where someone is being welcomed who did not come in with family, and my aunt's voice floated over the chatter as she said a woman's name I recognized from her signature line. And my mother stiffened just enough for me to feel it through the table, because Karen had arrived and was being walked toward us by a cousin who loved having a job, and I stood up slowly in the kind of movement that does not draw attention. Until it does, and as my brother finally lifted his head to see who was coming, my phone buzzed again with a notification that the partner had liked my announcement, which would push it even farther, and I thought, good, let the truth help itself to a seat. Because I am done setting extra places for lies, and I smiled at my mother the way a person smiles when they are about to choose themselves, while the room turned and Karen extended her hand. Karen walked in with that calm, professional presence that tells people she is not here to argue but also not here to be managed, and the cousin at her elbow announced her first name with the reverence our family saves for anyone who might write a recommendation letter. And when she reached our table, she greeted my mother first, because she understands hierarchy, then turned to me and said my full name with a small smile that sounded exactly like the emails we have exchanged, and before anyone could classify her as my brother's guest or my guest, she added in a clear voice that she had been nearby and wanted to stop in to congratulate me on the fellowship, which was a sentence so simple and so unbreakable that it slid through the room like a blade. Clean and quiet, leaving behind a space nobody knew how to fill. I thanked her and introduced her to the uncle who loves titles and to the aunt who pretends she does not read her phone at the table, and while I did that, my mother tried to steer the conversation back toward diploma talk by asking Karen if she worked with graduates often, which was her attempt to fold this new person into my brother's event, but Karen did not take the bait. She just said that the organization partners with fellows across different industries, and that my placement would involve a leadership track I had earned, and then, with the softest pivot I have ever seen, she asked my brother if he was considering applying next year since the program typically does not take siblings in the same cycle. And the politeness of that question was its own kind of mercy, because it gave him a way to step back with dignity without forcing a confession, and for a second I hoped he would take it. He tried, or at least he tried to look like he was choosing a generous retreat, saying something about exploring options and respecting timelines, but his best friend, who cannot leave a spotlight without taking a bow, blurted that he had only made the announcement because he thought it was already decided and that he had been under the impression my brother was in, which was a laughable phrase if you know how these things work, and Karen, bless her spine, said that she did not want to get into process details today, but that if there was confusion she would clear it up privately, and she looked at me when she said privately, and I understood that she was giving me ownership of the moment without turning the party into a tribunal, which I appreciated more than I can explain. Around us, the room shifted in those tiny ways that add up to a verdict, the turned heads, the quick glances at phones, the sudden interest in how exactly one applies to a program like this. And I watched a cousin who had been loudly impressed with my brother a half-hour earlier now ask me what the interview stages were like, which was not about validation as much as it was about gravity. Because truth has a weight that pulls conversation into its orbit, and I felt it settle into place without me pushing, and it was a relief so physical it almost made me lightheaded, not from triumph, but from the simple fact of not having to hold the dam anymore. My mother rallied in the way she always does when she senses control slipping, praising my brother's perseverance, mentioning how he had helped me practice for mock interviews, which was her favorite revision of reality because it makes him the protagonist in every room, and for a moment I considered letting it pass to keep the peace we pretend to care about, but I remembered how many times peace has been code for my silence. So I smiled and told Karen that the panel questions had been tough, and that it helped that I had spent months gathering data and building a case for my project, and then I added, almost as an afterthought though it was not, that I had kept the process private because I wanted to carry it on my own merits, which was a sentence aimed at nobody and everybody, and I watched it land exactly where it needed to. Karen turned to my brother with the kind of kindness that does not bend and said she admired families who show up for each other, and that the best way to support a fellow is to help her tie up loose ends at home so she can hit the ground ready. Then she faced me and asked if I had everything I needed for the move: housing questions, onboarding, small logistics that sound boring until you realize they are the scaffolding of a life, and I said I was set for now, that I would send her the last document Monday, and she nodded like a person confirming a plan already in motion, and the nod became its own statement to the wider group, because it did not ask for permission, it acknowledged momentum. The best friend, who had been trying to recover his footing, raised his glass once more with a joke about being careful what you announce at parties, but it fell flat, partly because too many phones were lighting up with my update, and partly because Karen's presence had turned rumor into context and context into clarity, and my brother understood that, which is why he set his fork down and leaned toward me with that look that used to work on me when we were younger. The one that asks for rescue without admitting wrongdoing, and he whispered that if I said a few words about how proud I was of him, everyone would forget the mix-up, and I looked at him and said I was proud of him for graduating, which is true and not small, but that I was not going to fix a narrative he created, and his face did that quick hardening that tells you the charm is over and the grievance has arrived. I stood then, not to perform or to grandstand, but because sitting felt like agreeing to hide in my own life, and I tapped my water glass once, not for attention but for a pause, and I thanked everyone for coming to celebrate my brother's achievement, which matters and stands on its own, and then I said that since the fellowship had been mentioned, I should do the polite thing and share the news clearly so nobody left confused, and as I said it I could feel my mother's stare trying to pin me back into the chair and the best friend's smug hope that I would make a scene he could narrate later, but I kept my voice even and my words plain, and I looked at Karen, who gave the smallest nod, as if to say the floor is yours if you choose it, and I chose it, because choosing it was the point, and I took a breath that felt like a beginning and said, I will keep this simple and short, and then I told them exactly what I had earned and exactly how my brother had inserted himself into it, without my consent, and I stopped right before the part that would change everything, because what I was about to reveal did not just explain the lie, it named the cost, and you could feel the room lean forward as if a single body, waiting for the last card to turn. I kept my voice even because I've learned that the person who keeps their tone steady owns the room even when they are saying things that make people shift in their chairs. And I said that the reason I had stayed quiet until now was not because I lacked news, but because 2 days after I got the offer I received an email from the director asking me to confirm whether a family member was authorized to speak on my behalf, which was odd and a little funny until I read the follow-up where this same family member asked if my start date could be moved, if the title could be tinkered with, and if a welcome announcement could be held because he wanted to coordinate messaging, and I did not name my brother out loud because I did not need to. I simply said that the messages came from a personal address I recognized and that I had written back, on copy to the director and the partner, with a very polite note clarifying that I speak for myself, and that any further outreach using my name should be disregarded as unauthorized, and I added that I had changed my passwords and asked the organization to flag any similar attempts so that my onboarding would not be derailed by confusion masquerading as help. And as I said it, I watched faces change from pleased to alert, which is what happens when a party learns it has been hosting a story with missing pages. Before anyone could jump in with the usual soft focus excuses about misunderstandings and good intentions, I turned to Karen and asked if she could explain the policy her team follows when someone tries to represent themselves as a liaison without written consent, and she did what I hoped she would do, which was to stay calm and factual and say that the partner treats misrepresentations seriously because it puts legal and ethical pressure on everyone involved, and that, as a rule, they flag the Account associated with the misrepresentation, they notify the candidate, and they restrict that person from participating in the current or the following cycle. Not as public punishment, but as a boundary that protects the program and the people doing the work, and she said it gently while looking at the table and not at my brother, which was its own act of mercy, but the meaning was not soft at all. And you could feel the air shift as the words landed in a place my mother could not rearrange. My brother leaned forward the way he always does when he thinks charm might turn a red light green and said there had been a misunderstanding, that he had only reached out to help, that he thought he was smoothing logistics for me because I am too busy to look after details, and I let him finish because I wanted him to hear his own framing out loud, and then I said that help I did not ask for is not help. That speaking for me is not support, it is control with a smile, and that I had kept receipts not because I enjoy paperwork, but because this exact dynamic has followed me since we were kids, where my accomplishments become group projects the minute they are interesting, and I said it without heat and without chapter and verse history. Because I was not auditioning for pity, I was laying down facts that did not require anyone's permission to be true. The best friend, who had been reduced to a background actor by the presence of actual information, tried to throw him a rope by saying he must have been excited and that plenty of people would have blurred the details by accident. And I looked at him and said that a blur is when you repeat a rumor at a barbecue, while a plan is when you use a program's official language to sell a story about yourself and you do it multiple times to multiple people. And I could see him realize the rope he had thrown was attached to a weight, because my phone buzzed on the table with another notification showing that the partner had liked my announcement, which had now picked up velocity in the professional circles the friend likes to hover around. And suddenly his grin looked like it did not fit his face anymore. I told the room that I was not going to turn this into a takedown because that does not feed me and never has, that I wanted what I have always wanted, which is to be allowed to carry my own name without interception, and then, because I promised myself I would stop cushioning the truth so it does not upset people who depend on my cushions, I said that I had also learned that my brother sent a note to the donor's office attaching my project overview with his name dropped into the first line, which he must have thought passed for initiative, except that the document string tracked back to my original file, and the donor's assistant forwarded it to me asking if I had changed my name recently. And I read that line to the table because there is nothing quite as clarifying as someone else's words read verbatim, and the few relatives who still wanted to call this a misunderstanding went very quiet. Because there are levels to confusion, and this had climbed a few too many flights. My mother tried a last stand with that brittle smile she uses when her world is wobbling, saying we were all proud and that family should speak as one voice, and I nodded to let her know I heard her, and then said that one voice is a nice slogan until that voice is not yours, at which point it is a muzzle, and that I would not be wearing one today or tomorrow or next year, not in front of guests and not behind closed doors, and I thanked her for asking me to keep the peace, because I had kept it in the only way that works, which is to make sure the facts are loud enough to drown out the storytelling, and I meant it, because I could feel something settle in me that was not triumph but relief, like I had stepped out of a costume I did not agree to put on. Then I did the thing I came to do, which was to end it cleanly without screaming or gloating or handing anyone a fresh grievance to dine out on later, and I said that I had scheduled one simple email that would go to everyone who had been told a version of this story, thanking them for celebrating my brother today and clarifying, in friendly and unmistakable language, that I had accepted the fellowship and would be relocating in early fall, and that any previous confusion came from people speaking on my behalf without authorization, which would not be happening again, and as I said it my phone chimed because the timer hit. And I watched 3 more heads dip to read and then look back up at me with a new expression I recognized from the rare times in my life when I have drawn a hard line and not moved, and it looked like respect, which is louder than applause when you have not heard it in your own house. Karen stood and excused herself with a handshake for my mother and a quick congratulations to my brother on his degree that did not sound fake, because both things can be true at once. And as she left she told me she would expect that last document on Monday and that her door was open if I needed anything, which in our language meant I did not need a translator anymore. And after she walked out my brother scraped his chair back and went outside without looking at anyone, which I let happen. because managing his exits is not my job, and my mother followed him with a look that asked me to fix it, and for the first time in years I did not take that look on as a task. I just picked up my glass and sat down like a person who has nothing to apologize for. After the cake was boxed and the aunts started whispering to each other about travel plans and the cousins were comparing my update to their own hopes, I stepped into the hallway and opened a final draft I had kept for months without letting myself believe I would send it, and it was addressed to me with a subject line about housing and a city I used to only say to myself at night. And I signed the lease with my full name and hit submit, and the tiny confirmation felt bigger than any toast. Because the last move in this plan was not the email, not the policy, not the announcement, it was leaving and leaving on my own terms, and as I stood there my mother came up behind me and asked whether I felt good about how it went, which is the kind of question you ask when you want someone to hand you their doubt, and I told her that I felt honest, which is better, and that I was done trading my honesty for anyone's comfort, and I hugged her because I am not made of stone, but I did not negotiate the hug into an agreement to be small again. He has not called me since, which says more than any speech he could have made on that patio, and I will not pretend that it does not sting a little, because I am not made of stainless steel either, but the sting is clean and the air is clear. And when I packed my boxes the next morning, I packed the email threads and the acceptance letter and the lease and the certainty that I can build a life without asking permission from people who prefer me as a supporting character, and if that sounds harsh, then maybe it finally matches the reality I was living in. Because the part that matters is simple. I did not burn the house down. I just turned on the lights, and when the lights came up the story looked exactly like it always did. Only now everyone else could see it. And if you were asking whether it was too far, I am telling you it was just far enough, and when the door closed behind me, it felt less like an exit than a beginning, which is, I think, the only revenge worth having.